December 16, 1944, and Private John Harper was dying in a Belgian barn. The wound in his side was bleeding through his uniform, his ammunition was almost gone, and through the gaps in the stone walls he could count at least 30 German soldiers taking positions around the building. They had him surrounded, machine guns pointed at every exit, and he could hear their voices getting closer as they discussed in German how they were going to flush him out or just wait until he bled to death. He'd been separated from his unit 6 hours ago when the German counterattack hit, running through frozen forests while artillery shells turned trees into splinters, and now he was trapped with no way out and no chance of survival. The Germans knew he was in here, they had all the time in the world, and Harper was just one wounded American private with maybe 20 rounds left and a German stick grenade he'd taken off a dead soldier that morning. Harper wasn't supposed to be a hero because back in Pennsylvania he'd worked at his father's hardware store, failed his first attempt at basic training because he couldn't do enough push-ups, and barely qualified with his rifle on the second try. His sergeant had called him average, the kind of soldier who follows orders and does his job but never stands out, never volunteers for the dangerous assignments, never gets recommended for medals or promotions. He'd been in Belgium for 3 weeks, mostly digging foxholes and standing watch, seeing more frozen mud than actual combat until the morning everything exploded. The Battle of the Bulge had started with such violence that Harper's company was shattered before they even understood what was happening, German tanks rolling through morning fog while artillery turned their positions into chaos. And Harper had run because everyone else was running, and when he finally stopped running, he was alone. If stories like this get your heart racing, hit that subscribe button because we dive into the most insane moments of World War II every week. And trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming. What Harper didn't know as he pressed his hand against the wound in his side and tried to think of any possible way out of this barn was that in the next 3 hours he would make a decision that would kill 41 German soldiers, haunt him for the rest of his life, and create one of the most controversial incidents of the entire Battle of the Bulge. This is the story of the barn that burned with 41 men inside, and the desperate American private who lit the match. The barn where Harper had taken shelter was typical for this part of Belgium, a massive stone and timber structure built 100 years ago to store hay, house animals, and protect farm equipment from the brutal winters. The foundation was thick stone, 3 feet of solid rock that had stood since before Belgium was even a country, but everything above that first story was wood and timber, massive beams cut from old-growth forests and dried for decades until they were hard as iron but would burn like gasoline if you gave them a spark. The ground floor was packed with hay bales, thousands of pounds of dried grass that farmers had stored for winter feed, and the loft above held even more, creating a space that was basically a giant tinderbox waiting for flame. Harper had chosen this barn because it looked solid, because he could see the stone walls and thought maybe they'd stop bullets. But he hadn't thought about what all that dry hay and old wood would mean if things went wrong. The German patrol had found him by accident because they were using this farm as a rally point, 41 Wehrmacht soldiers from different units who'd gotten separated during the offensive and were gathering here before pushing west to rejoin their divisions. Their lieutenant was a veteran of the Eastern Front who'd survived 3 Russian winters, and when his men reported hearing movement in the barn, he didn't rush in like an amateur. He positioned machine guns covering both doors, put riflemen in windows of the farmhouse with clear lines of fire, sent scouts around back to watch for escape attempts, and basically turned that barn into a prison with walls Harper couldn't see but couldn't cross. The Germans weren't in a hurry because they had Harper trapped, and they knew wounded men don't last long in December cold, so they could wait until he either surrendered or died, and either way they'd secure the barn and move on. Harper realized he was dead when he tried the back door and saw 2 Germans with a machine gun pointed right at it. He crawled to a gap in the stone foundation and saw 3 more soldiers smoking cigarettes and watching that exact spot. Every exit was covered, every window had eyes on it, and through the walls he could hear German voices discussing their next move, talking about whether to burn him out or just starve him into surrender. His wound was getting worse because the bleeding hadn't stopped and he was starting to feel cold in a way that had nothing to do with December weather, the kind of cold that comes from losing too much blood, and he knew if he didn't do something in the next hour he'd pass out and wake up in German hands if he woke up at all. That's when Harper found the jerry cans in the corner behind some hay bales, 6 of them, each holding 5 gallons of gasoline that the Germans had stashed here earlier. The Wehrmacht did this all across Belgium during the Bulge offensive because fuel was precious and they couldn't always get it where they needed it, so advanced units would cache supplies in barns and farmhouses and schools, anywhere they could hide resources for the divisions coming behind them. Harper had no idea why the Germans had put fuel in this particular barn, but there it was, 30 gallons of gasoline sitting in a building full of hay and dried wood, and the moment he saw those cans his mind started working on an idea so desperate and terrible that his hands shook as he unscrewed the first cap. The plan was insane because it meant burning the barn with himself inside, trusting that he could light the fire and escape through a hole in the foundation before the flames caught him, and hoping the Germans would be so surprised that he'd have a chance to run before they recovered. Harper knew it was suicide, knew the odds were he'd die in the fire or get shot during his escape or bleed out in some ditch, but staying in the barn guaranteed death, and at least this gave him a chance. He spent 20 minutes preparing, moving quietly so the Germans wouldn't hear, pouring gasoline along the base of hay bales and soaking wooden support beams, creating trails of accelerant that would spread flame fast once he lit them, making sure the entire ground floor was ready to explode into fire. He used his combat knife to widen a gap in the stone foundation at the back of the barn, creating a hole just big enough for a man to squeeze through, hidden behind equipment where the German guards wouldn't see it unless they walked right up to the wall. What Harper didn't know was that while he was preparing his escape, the German lieutenant had ordered some of his men into the barn. 8 soldiers entered through the main door, rifles ready, moving carefully through the hay bales and equipment to search for the wounded American they knew was hiding somewhere inside. Another 12 climbed the ladder to the hayloft above, taking positions in the wooden beams where they could look down and spot Harper if he moved. The lieutenant was being thorough because he'd lost too many men to carelessness on the Eastern Front, and he wasn't going to lose anyone to a single wounded American in a Belgian barn, so he put soldiers inside and outside, creating overlapping fields of fire and making sure Harper had nowhere to hide. Those 20 soldiers moving into the barn had no idea they were walking into a death trap that was about to ignite. Harper heard the Germans entering and knew his time was up because in another minute they'd search the corner where he was hiding and it would all be over. He grabbed his stick grenade, pulled the cord to arm it, and threw it into a pile of gasoline-soaked hay 15 feet away. Then he dropped to his stomach and started crawling toward the escape hole as fast as his wounded body would move. The grenade exploded with a crack that echoed off the stone walls, and the gasoline ignited. The fire didn't spread, it erupted. 30 gallons of gasoline mixed with tons of bone-dry hay created an explosion of flame that went from ignition to inferno in less than 30 seconds, faster than anyone inside could react, faster than the Germans outside could understand what was happening. The ground floor became a sea of fire as every trail of gasoline Harper had poured ignited simultaneously, flames racing along the paths he'd created and jumping to hay bales that burst into flame like they'd been waiting decades for this moment. The wooden support beams, soaked in gasoline, became pillars of fire that reached toward the loft above. The 8 Germans on the ground floor tried to run for the doors, but the flames were everywhere, blocking paths and filling the air with smoke so thick they couldn't see which way to go. In the loft above, the 12 Germans realized too late that they were trapped because the only way down was the wooden ladder and it was already burning. They could see the fire spreading below them, could feel the heat rising through the floorboards, could hear their comrades screaming on the ground floor, but there was nothing they could do. Some tried to jump from the loft windows, but it was a 20-foot drop onto frozen ground and broken legs meant death when surrounded by fire. Others tried to climb down through the smoke, but the heat was too intense, the flames too high, and one by one they fell back into the loft as the fire consumed everything below. Harper squeezed through the foundation hole and crawled into the freezing December night, dragging himself away from the burning barn as fast as his wounded body could move. He made it maybe 30 yards before collapsing in a drainage ditch, and from there he watched what he'd created. The barn was completely engulfed, flames shooting 50 feet into the night sky, the roar of burning wood and hay so loud he could hear it over the screaming. He could see Germans outside the barn, the ones who'd been surrounding it, and they were running toward the building trying to help their comrades inside, but the heat drove them back. They fired their weapons at the barn, thinking maybe the American was still inside and trying to escape, not understanding that some of their own men were trapped in that inferno. The worst part was the screaming because Harper could hear men dying and knew he'd caused it. The Germans on the ground floor who didn't make it to the exit before the smoke overcame them. The soldiers in the loft who had nowhere to go as the floor beneath them caught fire. The men who made it to doorways but found them blocked by their own comrades outside who didn't realize anyone was trapped inside. Harper lay in that frozen ditch and listened to 41 men die, and every scream burned into his memory deeper than any wound. The barn's roof collapsed 8 minutes after Harper lit the fire, the massive timber beams giving way and bringing tons of burning wood down onto anyone still alive inside. The walls held because they were stone, but everything else was consumed, and the fire burned for 3 more hours before finally exhausting its fuel and dying down to smoldering ruins. German units in the area saw the flames from miles away and assumed it was an American artillery strike or maybe a bombing run, some piece of the larger battle that was tearing through Belgium. They didn't know it was one wounded private with a stick grenade and 30 gallons of their own gasoline. The German lieutenant who'd ordered his men into the barn was among the dead, along with all 20 soldiers who'd entered the building and 21 more who'd been too close to the exits when the fire exploded outward. Recovery teams found 41 bodies in the wreckage over the next 2 days, some burned beyond recognition, others crushed by the collapsed roof, several who died from smoke inhalation before the flames reached them. The German commander who investigated the scene wrote in his report that it must have been caused by American incendiary weapons or a large demolition charge, because one man with a grenade couldn't possibly have created such devastation. Harper was captured 4 days later, 15 miles from the burned barn, barely conscious from blood loss and exposure. The Germans who found him were from a different unit and had no idea who he was, just another wounded American to send back for medical treatment before interrogation. It wasn't until a week later, when Harper was recovering in a German field hospital, that an intelligence officer connected his patrol route to the burning barn and started asking questions. Harper told the truth because he was too exhausted and traumatized to lie, explained about the gasoline and the hay and the desperate escape, and the German officer called him a liar. No single soldier could kill 41 men, the officer insisted. It had to have been a commando team or saboteurs, probably a whole squad of Americans with demolition training. But Harper's story matched the physical evidence because investigators found the escape hole in the foundation, found the empty jerry cans that had held the gasoline, and found the grenade fragments in the hay. They also found testimony from German soldiers who'd been outside the barn and remembered hearing the grenade explosion before the fire started, and remembered seeing no Americans except the one man they had trapped inside. The evidence made it clear that Harper was telling the truth, that one desperate private had turned a barn full of German fuel and Belgian hay into a crematorium that killed 41 soldiers. Harper was repatriated after Germany surrendered, returned to American lines in early 1945 when prisoner exchanges began, and immediately faced a court of inquiry because someone in intelligence wanted to know if what the Germans claimed was true. The inquiry took 3 days and heard testimony from Harper, examined German documents, reviewed battlefield reports, and ultimately cleared him of any wrongdoing. The ruling stated that Harper had acted in legitimate self-defense, that he was trapped by enemy forces with no possibility of surrender or escape, and that his use of available materials to defend himself fell within the laws of warfare. The U.S. Army's legal position was clear: Harper had done nothing wrong, but that didn't help him sleep at night. Because Harper couldn't stop hearing the screaming, couldn't stop seeing the flames in his nightmares, couldn't shake the knowledge that he'd burned 41 men alive. His own wound had healed, but the psychological damage never did, and he spent the rest of his life wrestling with what he'd done in that Belgian barn. He told a reporter in 1947 that he understood the Army's position, understood that legally and tactically he'd made the right choice, but understanding didn't make the screams go away. He'd killed 41 men in 3 minutes, more than most infantry soldiers killed in the entire war, and he'd done it with fire, which felt different than shooting someone in combat, felt more personal and more terrible. The ethics of what Harper did have been debated by military historians for decades because it raises questions that don't have easy answers. Was he justified in using such a devastating method when he could have simply surrendered? Did the Germans' overwhelming numerical advantage make his action self-defense, or was it excessive force? Does the nature of death by fire make this different from killing the same number with bullets or grenades? How do we judge desperate survival decisions made by wounded, terrified soldiers who have seconds to choose between action and death? The Battle of the Bulge was full of desperate combat and impossible choices, but Harper's burning barn stands out because it was one man making a decision that killed 41 others in the most horrible way imaginable. What makes the story even more complex is that the German soldiers who died weren't SS fanatics or war criminals. They were regular Wehrmacht infantry, some of them conscripts who didn't want to be in Belgium any more than Harper wanted to be there. They were doing their jobs, following orders, trying to survive the same war that had trapped Harper in that barn. The lieutenant who positioned them around the building was tactically smart, using proper procedures to capture an enemy soldier without risking his men's lives. The soldiers who entered the barn were following orders from a competent officer. They weren't monsters, they were just German soldiers in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they died because Harper needed to survive. Harper returned to Pennsylvania after the war and never talked about Belgium except to that one reporter and later to a military historian researching the Battle of the Bulge. He worked at his father's hardware store, married a woman from his hometown, raised 2 children, and lived what looked from the outside like a normal, quiet life. But people who knew him said he never liked winter, never sat near fireplaces, and would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night with his wife finding him sitting on the porch no matter how cold it was. He died in 1982 at age 59, and his death certificate listed the cause as heart failure, but his daughter told the funeral director that her father had been dying since December 1944. The barn itself was never rebuilt because the Belgian farmer who owned it left the ruins standing as they were, maybe as a memorial or maybe because he couldn't bear to clear away the place where 41 men had burned. Local people in that part of Belgium knew the story, passed it down through generations, and some of them still point out the stone foundation that survived the fire when the old boundaries are visible through snow. It's not marked with any plaque or sign, just a few pieces of stone in a Belgian field, but it represents something important about war and survival and the impossible choices that combat forces have on ordinary people. Thanks for watching this story from the Battle of the Bulge, and if you want more incredible World War II stories that challenge everything you think you know about combat, hit that subscribe button because next week we're covering something even more intense. See you then.